Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. My guest today is Brian Merchant, and I always get the book title wrong. It's Blood. I don't mean with your book title, Brian. I start
All of
interviewing my
them.
guest, and then I'm like, wait, I've read the book. It's literally sitting here, but I can't see the title because my notebook is over it. Blood in the Machine. Is
That's right.
that the
Yeah, you
title?
got it. Yeah.
All right. Well, this book is fantastic. It is a strange work of deliberately anachronistic history, which in my opinion, all history is anachronistic. So just embracing it is a good thing about the Luddites and the similarities that the Luddites were facing, the situation they were facing 200 years ago, and the situation we face right now. So before we get into the weirdness and the anachronism and talk about jobs and AI and factory destruction, just tell us who you are and how you came to write this book.
Yeah. I am Brian Merchant, and I write the tech column for the LA Times as my day job. And this is my second book. The first one is kind of I like to think of it as kind of a people's history of the iPhone, looking at everything that goes into making those ubiquitous devices. Um, yeah, and for this one, it it kind of came about pretty circuitously. I was originally interested in the Luddites in sort of the myth busting kind of way, right? It was the mid aughts, and I was working for Vice, and we were already, a little kind of, I guess, punkish in the way that we covered, but not like deeply super sort of, you know, critical of tech in like any sort of like Marxist sense or anything that, but we were always kind of into, picking fights and muckraking and muckraking and that kind of thing. So when I stumbled upon the Luddites, my wife, my partner, who's an academic, had some papers about the Luddites that I just kind of started reading, and it sort of disabused me of this myth that the Luddites were dummies, were sort of these nincompoops who didn't understand technology, and in fact they were completely sort of morally justified in having all these views that they had. They had a very salient critique of technology. Their campaign was very tactical, very smart, and their criticism, it turns out, sort of lingers on and resonates in a way that I thought was useful as we enter this quote new age of AI and automation. And the thing about a new age, as I'm sure your listeners are probably aware, is just that somebody decided to call it that. Now it's a new age of automation or AI or whatever, because that's what the pundits and the entrepreneurial class and all those have decided to call it. But being that as it may, it's useful to have this battery of critique ready to sort of to challenge it and to try to claw back some ownership and control over technology.
Yeah, so you've already touched on two of the things that are most important to me. First, the reason why we do this work, this historical work, and this is why I said it's all history is anachronistic, is because we need a toolkit, a usable past is the phrase to deal with what is happening today. So if you're writing history, it's anachronistic. You're writing history from today for people to read today. I don't think it's even possible to do history without, like, literally impossible to do history without that lens. And so the pretense that people can do history that way is that is a pretense.
Yeah, I know, and I appreciate that, because it's kind of funny. It's one thing that people like to ding me for this book is that it was a conscious choice and a stylistic choice that I made to sort of, well, I'm going to talk about the Luddites and their struggle and the big sort of early conglomerates that are wielding capital in this way that we would recognize today as a tech titan. So I use the same vernacular,
Yeah.
and some people don't like that, and it was something more than any other stylistic choice. Is probably the thing I thought about the most, but I thought that it would be more contextualizing, more useful, more sort of it would drive the story home more. I think and the fact that, I believe we really do have, a lot in common with these with the Luddites and the people who would become Luddites and the people who had solidarity with the Luddites, in that they're facing a similar set of circumstances. And as you say, so much of, history is unknowable, I guess, in a lot of terms, or is it depends on who's giving the history. The Luddites, for 200 years, we know the history of the Luddites from the people who crushed them.
Yeah.
That's the story that's handed down, right? Like, that's why we think of them as backwards dummies, because as soon as they started getting some traction, as soon as they became popular, as soon as they became the next Robin Hoods, which they were, then the crown had to pull the levers of power, and the people had to say, they had to say, well, they don't know what they're doing, they're all backwards, they're going to send Britain back into the Stone Age, or the equivalent of whatever that critique was. And they stamped them with that from the beginning. And it's just how, how power works, and that's the story that we hear about. So yes, I made a few, choices in telling this story. I didn't ever deviate from the facts as I saw them, as recorded from the
Mhm.
archives, but I use this language that I felt sort of stood, at least in my view, to sort of improve the resonance, to make it read more like something that people would recognize and feel in their gut.
Yeah, no, I think it worked for me. Although I should say I'm not a historian, like capital H historian, so I can't give you the historian's approval. I'm an English professor. I mean, I just had this conversation with the eminent Oxford historian John Morrill, and the thing is, the crucial thing there that you said that is important to me is that you're telling the story in this sort of anachronistic way because it has resonances, but of course you're also telling the story as truly as you can. There is a nihilistic version of anachronistic history
Yeah.
that's just like fuck it, who cares what happened, I'm just going to tell the story I want to tell. That is bullshit. I just want to point out that the
Yeah.
other one of just the facts, ma'am, that's also bullshit.
Yeah.
All history is caught between these two tensions. And yeah, I read the reviews, Brian, where they dinged you for like for using the word automation. And it's like you also pointed out, and sorry, this is a big spoiler for the book of a factoid, that the word automaton is goddamn 3,000 years old. I read that in this book, Brian, and I was just like, everything I have understood about humanity and AI and machinery is wrong because Homer was talking about automatons, which means Homer was talking about automation. Like, come on, people, give up the word. If automaton is in the Odyssey, then we've been dealing with automation since far before automation existed. It seems to be like deep in the human mindset. I'm talking in weird ways that I don't normally do, Brian, because your book got me thinking.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, this concept is, I think, it predates Jesus. I say at one point, because it does. This idea, and from the earliest days, it's like it's aspirational, right? Because it's before things like capitalism, where it's just like, well, what if we had these tools that could just kind of do things for us? As wouldn't that be great? Like, yeah, and yeah, if you could, in the Homer's talking about, like a blacksmith god that has automated little serving droids, basically, that bring the gods drinks. They also discuss some like early automated soldiers, and things like that. Things that would legitimately sort of uh, you know relieve drudgery or do a job that they didn't want to do, again, without outside the context of one person benefiting at the expense of others from that arrangement. Like, yeah, that looks pretty good. If I don't have to serve my guests drinks myself, if I have a robot to do it, then that's pretty cool. And another scholar that I talked to, Kanta D Hall, who has studied the history of artificial intelligence, and she points out that it was pretty much about until the Luddites' time that that humanity, sort of according to like sort of the written record of what was around, in terms of automation, was pretty positive. It was all, there wasn't this fear of automation that so much of sort of the punditry and the cultural products that we know today are concerned with. It was all, it was a very positive relationship, or aspirational relationship, to automation, and that changes when the industrial revolution gains steam, and it becomes clear that what's really going to happen is a handful of people are going to use automation as a tool to benefit themselves at the expense of an extant working class, and that's when the tide changes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just something I meant to say earlier and forgot. I need to throw it out there. If you've
Yeah,
ever, complained about anachronism, but you use the term robber barons when you're talking about Carnegie and Rockefeller, well, robber baron, that's actually a different thing. Robber baron is a guy who has a castle near a road. So, like, we can't escape anachronism. We think we're being period accurate when we say robber baron about Rockefeller, but that was an anachronism then, and they knew it. They were
yeah,
drawing a comparison between what was happening in industrial society and these things that have been happening in feudal societies. And now we don't even see the anachronism anymore because that's just how history accretes. And I
yes.
don't think it's wrong to be part of that accretion. In fact, I think it's right to be a part of that accretion.
Yeah, and honestly, that was what there's the anarchy in my own house in the
Anarchy in the
background.
back
Yeah.
room, man. That's
Uh,
how this podcast rolls. Go for it.
but yeah, so that was the goal. That's what ultimately tipped me in the favor of taking this approach. In that a tech titan, and what we understand a tech titan to be today, somebody like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, somebody uh, who he sort of gets credited with making these groundbreaking innovations and inventing things, and well, that it's not really the case. We know that now. They use some capital to buy a company. They find new ways to sort of exploit labor and to drive them harder and to squeeze more productivity out of workers. They're not they're this that mold, that exact mold. I have a whole chapter called The First Tech Titans that's about the guy who kind of minted this standard. And the reason I use this term tech titan is because Richard Arkwright, the guy who patented and claimed to invent the water frame, uh, first of all, did not. It turns out that, just like a lot of our tech titans today, he lifted the technology from an early partner that he threw under the bus. Big shades of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak there. He kind of took over the company and the profit streams and the credit. And then even at the time, they were his admirers were saying his biggest innovation was not with the technology, but the fact that he had this willingness to bring workers to heel in service of the new
Mm.
technologies, just like somebody like Jeff Bezos is. Like Amazon's like website that you click and you get a product, like that's not that innovative. There were plenty of websites throughout the 90s and the aughts, but when you have a warehouse that says, okay, like we're going to get everybody here to put the item in the cart as fast as a robot could, organizing labor to that degree and making it feel like you're getting something timely when you click that button, all on the back of human labor. And when you can make that feel as machinic as possible, that's what you're feeling with Jeff Bezos. That's what he did more than anything else. He mobilized labor using technology to surveil and sort of gamify labor regimes in innovative ways. Arkwright, 200 years ago, more than 200 years ago, pioneered this tactic of sort of just like, yeah, having a factory type situation where people sit in rows in windowless rooms in at machines, working them day in day out under an overseer, and people fucking hated that at the time. Like they revolted for a reason, because if this was the future, then they saw that sucked, right? Like before, you're working in your shop with your family around you, you're singing songs, you could take a break and walk through your garden. The Luddites were not just mad about lost wages and sort of that new machinery was arising that could do their jobs. That was part of it, but what they were really in their gut anxious and upset about was this sort of shape of the future, sitting in the factory standing at their command, as they called it. They hated to stand at their command. This was,
Mm.
it's the imposition of the factory system for the first time, really, like en masse. So they were fighting that formulation as much as they were fighting, the machinery. And at the time, it was pretty stark. Like everybody hated it. People really did have to be sort of beaten into submitting to this mode of work, or generational. That's why they shipped in children and child laborers who were either vulnerable or didn't know any different, or were from a poor family that needed the money. And that's what they wanted. They wanted these pliable people who didn't know that things could be better. And that's when the factory system really took off, when it was fully staffed. Arkwright, who I'd been yammering about, his factory was filled with 2/3 operated by children, some as young as 6 years old. Machines whirring around, clanking around, arms getting caught in them, people getting smashed. It was really, really nasty. So his innovation wasn't, oh, I've got this technology that I fine tuned in my lab. No, it's like getting people to work those machines, and sort of breaking their will, basically. And that's the language that even his advocates used at the time.
Yeah, I've been really struck by recent research that suggests that the sort of like 19th century factory that looks to us like this new thing is actually an extension of these two other things that go associated with colonialism: plantation slavery, and then merchant ships, which like stand at your command. This idea that there was some place you had to be for the system to work, and there was someone else's whose job it was to watch and make sure you were there, and physically beat you if you weren't there. That seems to me to have started in the 15th and 16th centuries. The difference is it was far away, it was on the periphery. And as I was reading your book and thinking about this, I was thinking about one of Cory Doctorow's claims, which I find very convincing, which is when they roll out these awful technologies, they start with children, prisoners, the poor, and then they work their way up. And so he's thinking about, keystroke monitoring. But you can think of the factory
Yeah.
as the exact same thing. It was okay to have plantations, but we could think of them as factories if it was enslaved Africans. And it's one step or maybe three steps forward to have it be, the adult men, the yeomen who are the real British, if my British listeners can accept the real American
Right.
phrase, but for the real English, I should say. So you start with children, and then you work your way up, and it's the same process. At least I thought so. I was struck by that again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's certainly the case. And that's, there was, I think there was like there was a spectrum. There were people who were just, outraged at the fact that like children were being forced to work in this. Even at the time, like there was outrage, and people felt sorry for them. But just as powerfully, a lot of that resistance, the men and the skilled workers, quote skilled workers,
Mm-hmm.
found the idea of them doing this sort of labor in the mold of the children were being forced to work, degrading and emasculating. And that also sort of led a lot of the revolt. And it is interesting you mentioned the plantation slavery, because an interesting and horrific thing happened with that too. And that's that it almost, so that sort of mode of sort of mass organized, labor, and that we're talking about, does start, on the ships and in the plantation fields. But the logic of the factory, and what the tech titans do, and what Richard Arkwright did in mobilizing and making more efficient in the first, in the first sort of organization of slavery. I might get this backwards, but you would have a gang system, right, where people had their tasks and it was horrible, and you would have an overseer that was liable to whip you if you were not productive enough, but you still had at least this modicum of how you were doing your job.
Mm-hmm.
In part because of like of their export is flowing to Britain, and then they have all this new raw material, and then you have these men like Arkwright who are organizing labor just so they then that the new mode then flows back
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
the plantation and reorganizes slavery into the task system, which is much more regimented, much more factory-like in the sense that we consider it, and it becomes even more brutal, like even more awful. And then you have some, Luddite like resist. I do a chapter in the book that looks at um, an enslaved worker, Charles Ball, who is working at the same time that the Luddite uprising is happening in England, and a lot of these same motivations, this desire to automate, to increase production, and it has all these horrific unintended consequences, and it catches workers even more vulnerable, even more suffering, undergoing more suffering than the impoverished cloth workers of England. So it's all tied up into
Yeah.
this transatlantic system, that is just sort of this puzzle box of horrors, and it is governed by this new possibility and this new idea that you can automate a system to increase productivity, and people are thinking and arguing that you can get machines to do all this stuff, and in every case it's not. Eli Whitney, the inventor of the cotton gin, once remarked, he's like, this will solve slavery probably, because
Yeah.
if we can automate the production of this part of the cotton process, we can get the of course, what does it do? It just makes the demand for raw cotton soar through the roof, and it some historians say it extends the lifeline of slavery for decades as a result of this. It was kind of, while it looked like there might have been a possibility the abolitionists could have helped stamp it out. We'll never know now, but it just, like, now there's this new thundering rationale for it, for more slavery, and it's just this, it's really just horrific to think about that. We still have guys today thinking, oh, this is going to be great if we just sort of get the human out of the equation. I can automate this process. I can do it with AI. I can do it with robotics. I can do it with such minuscule amount of thought given to, like, how it might actually affect a real world system, that they just don't care, and they haven't cared for 200 years. And part of the project of this book is trying to get more people to care, and them, people to recognize that these people don't care, and try to build some power to confront that.
Yeah, that's a that's a really important point you made about the factory ideas getting re-imported back into the colonial system, because it is true when you read the accounts of the overseers and the shipmasters 300 and 400 years ago, they're quite happy to utterly dehumanize the sailors and the slaves, but they don't actually feel like they have that much control over their labor. They're always afraid it's going to slip out of their hands because some of these systems of surveillance and control haven't been developed yet. And in that respect, the great innovation of the true factories, whatever you call them, in the 19th century is not the steam stuff and the water stuff and the technology, but it is the way that the people can be forced to work with machines like machines. That is the difference. And you're absolutely right. The people in the ships and the enslaved Africans on the plantation, they are not treated like humans, but in some core way, they're not treated like machines yet either. And that is a jump, I think, in the 19th century. I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, I do think so, and that's when at least you see the melding of language. There's, like, really some interesting texts from some of the first. I think I call them, like, business futurists. That's kind of Andrew who was actually the guy that Marx got a lot of his ideas about automation and accelerating production from. Um, but he really, this guy was, like, really just all in for the factory, and he was, kind of, he was, I guess he was, like, kind of an early consultant. He was, like, a chemist by trade, but he wrote all these books about how great the factory was, and starting in the early 1800s, he's promising that, just around the corner we're going to see the factory become an automaton that just, like, works without people involved. But for right now, you need the people in there sort of work. So you're seeing, like, the actual melding of the language of these ideas. And it's, of course, 200 years later, there's no such thing as a factory that requires no human input or human intervention. There's, you still need the workers on the assembly line or doing maintenance or doing all of these things, invisible though they may be. But this idea sort of, like, grafts on to the organization of the factory. So you have, like, factory and technology becoming kind of synonymous with industrial progress at that point. And that's why the Luddites, for daring to speak up against it, for daring to denounce that, then have to be situated as being anti-progress because they're anti this whole form. And if they had won, we might have seen any number of interesting reconfigurations of work and technology, and more democratic ways of developing that technology, more say over how. But they didn't, and instead we get this like very binary, very bleak sort of vision of what industrial progress, what progress itself actually is.
Yeah, so now we just have to. You've hinted at this a few times, but I don't know if the listener knows necessarily. We have to do this, what it means to be a Luddite, because I'm quite happy to be considered a Luddite in that I just got rid of my smartphone and I have all sorts of, in these sort of like Thoreauvian, Emersonian ways. I'm anti-technology or the latest technology. I'm growing more anti-technology as I age. I just turned 40. But being anti technology, which is what we use the word Luddite to mean now, that's a slur on the Luddites. They were not anti technology. They wanted, precisely as you just said, a different, and obviously from where you and I are sitting, a better configuration of society. So just take it away on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine for the time at the in their day, the technology that is most front of mind for most of these folks is either the hand loom or the stocking frame, or the implements that they're using in their trade. And it is technology. That's the most cutting edge technology of the day. And they're fluent in it. They're skilled in it. They are technicians. Some of them are what we would call technologists today, right? Some of them are always experimenting with their machines, improving it, meddling with it, experimenting with it, building new machinery. But they don't get remembered as the great inventors of history because they weren't doing it to try to maximize profit in a giant factory, at the expense of someone else. They were technologists though, and that is really important to know. So number one, they were technologists. So being technicians and technology, they were better versed in sort of what was happening, what the entrepreneurs, what the elites wanted to do with this technology, the new and sort of automation machinery that was emerging. Some of it was new, some of it was just being put into new uses. Again, to our earlier point, it's not the technology that matters so much, it's the context. So some of this stuff had been around for 20 years by the time that it starts really appealing to elites to say, well, what if we just got 100 of them, put them all in a room, hired children to run them? I bet we could charge a lot less for cloth than that knitting concern or that weaving concern down the street that's been operating under the same parameters for 200 years. So it was this mobilization of technology that the cloth workers recognized and protested. So starting around the very sort of turn of the century in the early 1800s, it becomes pretty clear. This is about 10, 15 years after Wealth of Nations has come out and sort of caught on among a bunch of the sort of the elites in England at the time, and among industrialists who are kind of using this as a blueprint or sort of a justification for starting to divide labor and create factories again, which is very unpopular at the time. So they see this coming factorization that employs this new sort of automation, and they see that it's just decreasing their wages. They're taking a hit because the new factory owners can mass produce stuff. They can't. They can lower their stuff is much poorer quality, so they're charging less. Now they have to compete on price. It's driving wages down. It's driving prices down, and the workers are beginning, in some cases, to go hungry. So they are fighting this at a number of levels. Most notably at Parliament, they're trying to petition, say, "Hey, these new technology, these new entrepreneurs, these new tech titan people, again, they don't use those words, I do, they're not paying attention to the laws on the books that say we need to have apprentices in this trade, and we have to have this certain kind of cloth count, and they're getting away with all this stuff. They're ruining the reputation of our trade. They're putting us out of work. They're immiserating us. And Parliament, which is in the throes, as the historian Eric Hobsbawm says, was in its most ferociously conservative period. So they say no. Any sort of subsistence for you guys, any sort of minimum wage, which is what a lot of the weavers wanted, any sort of welfare benefit is out of the question, because that'll distort the market. So they basically say you're on your own. In 1809, Parliament tears up all the regulations altogether and fully leaves sort of the cloth workers to their fate. Remember, there's hundreds of thousands of cloth workers. This is, like, in hindsight, this is kind of an insane move to say hundreds of thousands of cloth workers, the largest industrial working base of England at the time, the largest occupation aside from agrarian workers. We're just going to kind of leave them to the wolves, basically. And so they can't organize because there's laws on the books called the Combination Acts that ban unionization, and now they've been sort of rebuffed and thrown out by Parliament after being investigated for union activities. And I'll mention. So when an economic headwinds go the wrong way in 1810 and 1811, there's a bad harvest. There are trade sanctions that dry up a lot of their markets. Shit just hits the fan, basically, and they, as a tactic of last resort, they become Luddites, and they embark on the campaign of what they're most famous for now, and that's machine breaking. And again, it's tactical. They send letters to entrepreneurs saying, "We know you've got 100 of these machines. If you don't take them down, you're going to get a visit from Ned Ludd's army. If he takes them down, then fine, they don't show up. If he leaves them up, then they show up in a militarily organized sort of platoon, and they hold the overseer up at gunpoint. They go in and they smash the automating machinery, and just the automating machinery, and they leave with a warning: if you bring the machines back, we'll come back and do the whole place." So that's that begins sort of the Luddism in earnest in 1811, and it becomes just this sort of thunderous, popular, folk heroic campaign.
Yeah, one of the things I was struck by in your description of their raids, and they're very similar to descriptions I've read and heard, especially from the history podcaster Mike Duncan, of the Boston Tea Party and the other events in America in the late 18th century. You could call this, I would call this direct action and link it up with an anarchist tradition. And they tend to be incredibly disciplined. The right wing description of this is like unruly mob, but actually the discipline and coordination and organization of this quote unruly mob far exceeds anything that you would see from, say, the soldiers who might end up shooting at them when they are not supposed to be firing on them. The discipline is actually in the hand of the Luddites. They
Yeah,
haven't. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, 100%. I mean, so part of so exactly, the Luddites are extremely disciplined, and they know, because from the beginning they're smart about this, and there's a reason they're so popular. It's because this sort of their campaign has this symbolic dimension where they're destroying this implement of inequality, this device that's being used to transfer wealth from one party, the working class, to the rich, and by smashing it, they're sending this message that we're not going to take it. We're not going to stand by and watch these machines, or these men use machines to impoverish us. So it just generates this thunderous kind of support, and they are, to the extent where, like, they're at one point, after they start doing this campaign, which is two things. It is, as you said, very sort of disciplined, and it is also decentralized, though.
Yeah,
it's
that's the
it's
that's the anarchist dream, right? Is disciplined but decentralized.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit more about how they pulled that off, but it really goes with it speaks to solidarity really, and Gavin Mueller, who's also written a great book about Luddites called Breaking Things at Work, really drives this point home in his book, and that's just that the Luddites had incredible solidarity. I mean, these are men and sometimes women who grew up in a tight knit community who had the same set of experiences and concerns and often sort of the same economic pressures. And you could, you know, back in the reform movement when there were sort of the Jacobin clubs coming to the UK, like you could infiltrate those meetings with a spy, right? Because they're often people who, like, have read Tom Paine and they want to sort of start a revolution, and it's people from all different walks. You cannot do that with a Luddite cell, right? There's these people that have been working together since they were 12 years old, apprenticing together in the same shop. They know everybody from the town. If a stranger kind of shows up at a pub at a Luddite planning meeting, you're just like, who is this guy? So it's when as soon as the first wave of Luddism proved so successful in Nottingham, and you do see some real successes. You see factory owners lowering their prices to what they were before they used the automating machinery. You see sort of people giving up the machines, say waving the white flag, saying like, look, I only did this because the Joneses down the street did this, and I don't want to mess with the trade. I don't want to mess with your livelihood. This is cool by me to like go back to the old ways. So you had a lot of people do that, and they won back some pay and concessions and protections. Um, and then since you have this very emulatable form where you're sending a letter, you're invoking Ned Ludd, who is Ned Ludd is a Robin Hood like figure that they probably made up, an apprentice who smashed his owner's frame after he had him whipped for not being productive enough. Ned Ludd is their mascot. Then he flees into Sherwood Forest, legend goes, and he starts raising an army. But you could emulate that. So in Lancashire and the West Riding of York and in Huddersfield and Leeds and Manchester, all these different places, you can have Luddite cells, and they're built from the local communities. There's no central organizing committee. They just follow this tactic, and because it's proven itself to be so effective, so you have both of those things sort of working in tandem. And again, for a while, it's really successful. The state has to crush it, of course. And so, to your point about the Luddites being disciplined versus the state not, the state just basically throws weapons, throws bodies, throws money at trying to crush the issue. They send more troops to occupy the industrial districts of England than were fighting Napoleon at the time. It's the largest domestic occupation in English history to try to crush these cloth workers. Again, this is the same government that had 10 years to try to address this in some sort of, good faith democratic way. Maybe that minimum wage could have, helped people out enough to where they didn't feel like they had to smash machines. Maybe there was another option, but by instead deciding to pour all their resources into just crushing it, it's another choice in shaping the sort of the pathway that industrialization, that the development of technology is going to take. And that's, we're going to side with the people who have the money, who have the resources to deploy it, and we're going to use force to do it. And they stationed all these troops all over the industrial districts, all over places like Manchester and Leeds. And it was unruly. There was a law that said if you had a pub, you had to take the king's men and feed them and house them. So you had all across England soldiers just sort of in barracks, living in pubs at the expense of driving these poor pub owners out of house and home. And it was, they were unruly. They would commit sexual assaults. They were the ones that were completely undisciplined, and their only job was if they got the call to try to go crush the Luddites, and they were incredibly bad at it because they really didn't care that much one way or the other, all these soldiers who are sort of lounging around. So it's really really pretty dark, but again, it's important to know
Yeah.
that that's how that's how this issue, the machinery question, quote they call it, gets resolved. Some people say like, oh well, the Luddites were wrong, like they lost. People wanted all these technologies and the products that they produced, so the market really won out. And that's not the case at all. The state intervened to such a thunderous extent that they crushed the opposing viewpoint with gunfire, by hanging them with nooses, and with this incredible show of force. And they forged the pathway of technological development. They decided, the state decided, not any consumer, not the market.
Yeah, I mean the irony is almost infinite. So if the justification, the like Smithian justification is like we need to leave the market alone because it's more efficient and these horrible violent monsters are attacking it. The solution is for the state to spend who knows how much money to do violence in an intervention that I cannot fathom the irony. And then we are told precisely as you say, and like that's just how it had to be. You can't fight progress.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. It is so perverse, and so it's almost like I want someone to do like a like an Ezra Klein style wonk blog. Like, look at like, well, the state would have had to spend this much to garrison this troop here,
Yes.
vis-a-vis the amount it would have cost to pay a minimum wage. Like,
Yeah.
because yeah, it is. It's absolutely just a decision where you want to make your state expenditures, and they decided that way.
Look, I've covered this on this podcast tons of times. Doing things the right way is almost certainly going to be cheaper. It's just going to end up with a certain amount of money with the wrong people. And this whole Adam Smith capitalism bullshit is just, I am sorry, an excuse to maintain the power and the status quo. And everyone who is listening to this podcast obviously is not surprised at all to hear me espousing these views, but it's just so obvious. They don't, the crazy thing is they don't even have the Ezra Klein style numbers on their side. It's just might makes right, and then the numbers are window dressing.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a really, really interesting period because you see this taking shape in fits and starts. And some of the elites are like kind of trying it on. There are like some converts, and they have an early convert to sort of the Smithian view in Pitt the Younger, who's like part of like the new, it's like really funny, like the new Tories. He's like younger. He's conservative, but cool. He's almost like this weird Paul Ryan type
Yeah,
figure, who's like, he is like kind of like the, so like all the, he's not like the old like landed gentry who are like kind of old fusty. He's all about the market, which again, even among the Tories at the time, there are some who are still much more wedded to the ideas of pastoralism and maintaining sort of mercantilism and the monopolies. So it's this interesting period of 2 decades or so where it's not exactly clear where it's going to break. And to your point, like to the extent that working people knew about Adam Smith, and they hated him, like they hated him, like you he there's one part in the book where one of the sort of the half Luddite, half reformer crusaders, Gravener Henson, really fascinating guy, a guy that the English historian E.P. Thompson, who wrote the great book, The Making of the English Working Class, sort of argues is one of like the three great unsung figures in shaping sort of working class consciousness. Well, he's a Luddite, and he's also trying to get the crown to reform, to try to find a more peaceful solution. He's trying to repeal those combination acts to allow unionization and that kind of thing. But during the period that the book's taking place, he's really fighting for basic protections, things like minimum wage and base wages, and some support for some sort of welfare support, some banning on sort of the more vampiric practices of the time, which was like paying people in goods or in truck instead of paying people wages. People just like give them stuff that then either they could sell or whatever, which is, you can't buy food with just stuff all the time. So they were trying to ban that. And he, when he's writing back, he's saying, he's like, we're sympathetic. I'm getting sympathetic ears, except for Dr. A's disciples. He always calls him Dr.
yeah,
A. It's Dr. Adam Smith. But because at that point, they weren't the most voluminous force in Parliament, but they were powerful. Spencer Perceval, who is the prime minister while this is going on, is a disciple of Pitt the Younger's. So you could see they're still trying to figure out how to wield the ideology to do exactly what you're saying, to sort of protect the elites, to sort of make a new justification for ignoring the poor and sort of doubling down on their own interests. And this is really one of those moments where you see that taking shape, just as coincidentally you see industrial capitalism taking shape.
Yeah, that actually brings me to the last thing as we're heading towards the end of this conversation that I wanted to make sure I discussed is very early in the book. You're talking about, I mean, I marked it because it leaps out to me something like this is the first time, that technology or automation can be, taking away people's jobs. And I would put it slightly differently, which is to say, I actually date the invention of, so the 20 years before this, when sort of these factories are happening but they're not being automated in the same way, I would actually call like the invention of the job, in the sense that like you go and clock in and your time is somebody else's. It's not at home, it's not an apprenticeship model with the expectation that you will be the master in the future, all this stuff. It's this factory model, which of course, if you work in an office job, you have a job. You're expected to go to a place and be somewhere in a certain time, and there's someone watching you, all that stuff. That was not particularly common until this period. And I would argue it's once you invent the job that you get the overseer, who is very different from a master in the old apprenticeship model, that you get people sort of rubbing their fingers together and thinking, I can get rid of some of these people and saving money. A master with journeymen and apprentices is thinking, look, they're just like me. We're all in this together. Someday they're going to inherit, they're going to be partners, or perhaps they're just doing some weaving at home. It's a totally different thing. There's no reason for a master with a bunch of apprentices to imagine automation.
Yeah.
It's jobs, this job, by which I mean this model of like a centralized boss and hierarchy with a bunch of workers who are surveilled and their time is owned by the company and they're doing tasks. Once you get jobs, the allure of automation is just incalculable, and that's why I think there's an anti-job vibe out there, which I'm certainly part of. It doesn't mean we're against work,
Yeah.
but this centralized system, if you pick that way of organizing society, all of these ills follow. They picked it, and then we got this, and then the wrong guys won. So I just wanted to throw that out there to
Yeah.
see what you thought.
No, I agree. I agree. Like, I mean, I guess you could try to, you could have a long conversation and probably an interesting one about like, when, we was something that we would define as a sort of a modern day job begins, or like what qualities or characteristics that has. But I think a job, something that, as you say, that you like, where you're selling your labor to somebody else and they're paying you a wage. Yeah, again, that's what that this notion, even if it wasn't so well delineated or apparent what was going to happen in the future, but that's why it was just so obnoxious to them, or so toxic to them, or so hated, because they sensed it.
Yeah,
That plugs right into the standing at their command. So once, maybe that's when that form of a job begins, is when you have to stand at somebody's command. And
I think so. I
yeah,
think so.
yeah.
All right, keep going.
Yeah, no, and I think, but and I have made this point before, and I think it's like this, when I was writing this book, the pandemic was going on, and then after the lockdown eased up, we have this right now. We're still in the midst of this thing. Well, people don't want to go back to work in the office, right? People, like, why? Why don't people want to go back to work? For all of the same reasons that the Luddites were sensing back then. They don't want to go somewhere where they're going to have a boss looking over their shoulder telling them what to do. It's not a pleasant way to live a life. It's not. You're having your liberty infringed upon, and however small a way, it's just undeniable. Your time is somebody else's. It's not your own. You're losing your autonomy. Your dignity is at stake because somebody else can tell you what to do, and you don't really have much recourse unless you're going to quit. So imagine never like we don't, those of us who are like kind of protesting going back to it, we've lived that, we grew up that way, it's an
Yeah.
inculcated into us, and now we're like, actually we've tasted what it's like to kind of be able to do our work at home, and now we don't want to. Imagine having never
Oh my
like
god.
sacrifice that. Imagine like, and imagine just like your job is how you want it to be. You have one task, and that is to weave this piece of cloth. However long it takes you, that's when you will get paid. You sell it to the merchant, and sure, you have disagreements or whatever, but it's governed by this sense of fair contract, of fair prices. Everybody just kind of, nobody wants to screw anybody else over. Of course you're going to have a few unscrupulous people, but this is just, it's a community more or less working in symbiosis, and nobody's just trying to overtly exploit somebody else. And that is changing when you see this overseer system, and you're looking up at that building. It has 3 stories. You know that there are people just sitting in a row at a clanking whirring machine where
Mm.
there's no windows, and somebody's just going to tell you when you can and cannot go to the bathroom. Just like that, I just imagine the revulsion and the repulsion that, somebody with pride and dignity and a sense of freedom about their lives, being told that that's what their future is, and that's what all your son's future is
Yeah.
going to be too, and that's, it's uh it's easy for me to understand on that level then, and maybe it's useful for people to think about that sort of groundswell of disgust. And it wasn't felt just by cloth workers. That was, you had, shoemakers, hat makers, coal, where everybody else was joining the Luddites in the streets, and it was puzzling to the authorities at the time. They're like, why? Like,
Yeah.
the steel worker, they're going to benefit from all these machines and stuff. It's like, that's not the point. The point is that this is just a giant exploitation machine, and it is just getting started, and they have a chance to stop it. And that's why the Luddites are so popular.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, the way you described production in this pre-factory, pre-automation model, if you described it that if you described wanting a world like that today, they would call you some terrible name like Luddite or anarchist or something. But oh my God, that's how it was.
Yeah.
That's how it was. Choices were made to get this other way, and now we run, we run our schools this way with the single overseer and all the people chained to their command. That's how we do it. Yeah, we got a taste of it. Well, some of us got a taste of it not being that way during the pandemic. Essential workers were chained even harder to their command than ever before.
Yeah.
From these two ends, we're seeing something. We're seeing unrest. It's certainly not looking anything like the depth of the Luddite movement, in part because we have a lot more work to do to imagine this different world, which is really just the pre 1800 world. And this book is great on that, and it's a thrilling read. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
All right, I just need to say before I let you go, anything else you want to say? You can have the last word.
Well, I would just quickly to add on to that last point you made, and again notice that the distribution of work and how the community was oriented, it really has very little to do with the technology itself. We could have
Mm.
a model that is not unlike that, or arranged however else we wanted, with the most cutting edge technologies in the world. The technology is
Yeah.
immaterial. We do not have to stop developing technologies that people find interesting. It's just right now, with the current economic regime we have, when something like AI is built, we can predict pretty well to the purpose that it's going to be used. So just something to keep in mind. It shouldn't be, a limiting factor. Don't let anybody tell you that you need to be anti-technology to explore alternative arrangements like this. And in fact, the Luddites are the best example of that. They were technologists themselves, and they fought for an alternative themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. The book is Blood in the Machine. Thank you.